Hi, welcome to Perchance to Read. Thank you for tuning in for a review of a book I've been meaning to get to for a long time. It's Walter Tevis's 1983 novel, The Queen's Gambit, a coming-of-age tale about an orphaned girl named Beth who turns out to be a chess wizard with a lot of demons. Tevis also wrote The Hustler and The Color of Money, two books about high-stakes competition among men in the seedy innards of America's pool halls. Tevis's idea to put a young girl in another kind of high-stakes arena on the international stage, playing a game that men had staked out for themselves, fascinated me. I wanted to see what he would do with it. Like many people, I heard about The Queen's Gambit, the book, when it became a hit streaming series that aired in 2020. I decided not to watch the show, though, until I had read the book. So I closed my ears to all the internet chatter about the series, which wasn't easy while the show was trending, and it meant that when I finally picked up the book, I didn't know where in the world or even for sure when the book took place. I was pleasantly surprised to find out it was set in 1960s smallish town Kentucky, which makes total sense. I mean, the setting reflects 1960s America, where board games were very much a thing, pretty much everywhere. It's too easy to set a book about chess in a big city in a big state, and Tevis goes for the much more realistic idea that chess could be played anywhere, so why not drop us into Kentucky? Going back to our girl protagonist for a second, I did wonder if Tevis would play on gender stereotypes or if he would just omit gender and let the reader grapple with his or her own ideas about gender and competition. Turns out he played it straight, with honesty about Beth's logistical challenges playing chess as a girl without adopting any stance of his own. I think the result is suspenseful and sad, uplifting and unusual, tragic and totally entertaining. Now, as I say that, I have to step out of story world for a second. Tevis had to tackle a real-life problem to tell his story, and that would be Bobby Fischer, Boris Spassky, and Anatoly Karpov, famous chess grandmasters who dominated in the 1960s and 1970s, which partially overlaps the same era in which the book is set. Basically, whether Tevis made Beth good or bad at chess, he knew Fischer, Spassky, and Karpov loomed. So in the author's note, Tevis lets us know that Fischer, Spassky, and Karpov don't exist in The Queen's Gambit. He explains that the truth of those players would make so much of the enjoyable fiction of The Queen's Gambit impossible. To tell Beth's story, Tevis needed to be able to move parts around to fit what was going on in book world, and including Fischer, Spassky, and Karpov would have walled him off, closed him in, and limited what he could do. It was a brilliant decision. Better to just pretend they don't exist in book world so that whether Beth wins or loses, we're not thinking, where's Boris Spassky? Where's Bobby Fischer? Going back to book world, as we said, the book tells the story of an 8-year-old girl who is orphaned on page 1, so that's not a spoiler. It's the 1960s, but don't expect 1960s TV parents or some rich aunt to swoop in and save her. I confess I was a bit worried about this premise in the first few chapters because one of my favorite books is Jane Eyre. And if you've read that book or seen one of the many filmed depictions of it, you know that Jane spends most of her childhood at the mercy of people who don't care much about her. I was sort of dreading that The Queen's Gambit was going to be a redux of early Jane Eyre in terms of Beth's rough life, but I was happily wrong. Jane Eyre and Beth Harmon are both young girls who are left to their own devices and defenses with not a lot of emotional, financial, or tactical resources. But the similarities as to how that plays out pretty much end there, drastically. The book really becomes about chess and Beth's relationship with it. And pushing the Jane Eyre comparison a little farther, where Thornfield Hall and Mr. Rochester become all-consuming for and of Jane, Beth, while also consumed by chess, has more control over her relationship to the game than Jane has to anything or anyone in her existence. It's the 1960s, and Beth is far more in charge of her mental attachment to chess than Jane is in charge of almost anything in her life. So where Tevis could have borrowed Charlotte Bronte's orphan girl schematics, he instead turns Beth into, well, almost a pool player we might see in his earlier novel, The Hustler. It's about the game of chess and Beth's desire to have full mastery of it. It's 3-ball, corner pocket, chess style. So then, a book about chess. Isn't it slow, you might ask? The answer is a surprising, emphatic no, mostly because it isn't just a book about chess, although many of the most exciting bits of the book involve chess. It's also about families, mothers, addiction, friendships, for sure friendships, and destiny. The pacing, especially early in the book, is excellent. The dialogue is snappy and moves the story quickly. If you've never played chess and frankly never wanted to, you'll still be okay and even enjoy the read. Tevis's introduction to the reader to the game of chess coincides with Beth learning the game, and so no time is wasted on just the game of chess. Instead, we're watching Beth go through the travails of her traumatic young life, and we're learning chess at the same time, and that whole process moves at a quick and even compelling pace. In fact, it's some of the most page-turning material in the book. At this stage, we're introduced to Beth's mind, her approach to competition, her assessment of her opponents as she becomes obsessed with the game. Through this lens, this deep dive into Beth's mind, we see how she deals and really doesn't deal with the traumas in her life, which have been substantial, especially for her age. To keep the reader caring about chess and the stakes, Tevis is careful to always have us sort of escorting Beth into each new challenge so that we buy into her stakes, while it also makes us feel like we're watching a sporting event. He's never condescending. He assumes we can follow along and talks to us accordingly, casually dropping pawn to queen 4 like we know what that means. And eventually we do. It's amazing. We learn all the moves and can begin to anticipate what Beth might do. We learn the Sicilian defense, the King's Gambit, and yes, the Queen's Gambit, among other strategies. We may not know the moves, but we know the significance of when Beth uses them. We're nervous. We sometimes detest the opponent. We feel threatened wherever Beth feels threatened. It can be wonderfully nerve-wracking when she's in danger on the board, with the kind of suspense you experience when watching a heist movie and you're rooting for the thieves to get out of there before they get caught. The pages fly by. With just a couple of not too painful exceptions, the pace of the chess games is breakneck and not boring. It seems too that Tevis wants us to feel that a large part of what drives Beth is abandonment and anger and not just winning games of chess, which would get dull after 50 or 60 pages. But rather than beating us over the head with Beth's demons, Tevis either lets them linger in the background or he displays them through Beth's sometimes horrible choices. Mercifully, Tevis avoids the trope of Beth being out to win the game, to prove everybody wrong. She wants to win to prove she can figure out the puzzle each game presents, to reinforce her mind and the way it's built, and the way she thinks, and therefore the way she approaches life. The fact that resentment could be the driving motivation for Beth's desire to be great at chess, and still somehow isn't, works to reinforce how much she really just wants to outrun the strategy of each game. And this brings me to Tevis's writing style, because to avoid those obvious tropes, Tevis puts Beth in funny, tragic, and odd situations that keep our attention. In terms of the writing style, I kept hearing, in air quotes, shades of Ann Tyler, who writes beautifully quirky characters who do very real things in their own quirky way. One of my favorite Ann Tyler characters is a dutiful wife and mother who, on a lark, leaves her family by taking a long walk on a beach during a family outing and just never turning around to head back to her family's spot on the beach. She just keeps walking until she lands in another town and adopts a new life. Tevis's characters seem to be cut from the same cloth. Beth and the people around her can be oddballs at times, but it's always plausible and in accordance with the rules of book world. The Queen's Gambit is a good old-fashioned 80s read with not a lot of figurative CGI and just folks being folks, but it may still strike some of your modern sensibilities. What I mean is we've become so used to shaping fictional ugliness in a way that says, but we, the audience, aren't like this, and the storytellers aren't like this, only the character is like this, and have found ways to tell horrid and horrifying stories without the author or the audience participating in, for example, bigotry or one-off comments about culture. So in the few places where Tevis just lays it out there and leaves it to you to attach the attitude to the character and not to him as the author narrator, it stands out a bit and takes you out of the story, even if just long enough to say, Wow, I can't believe he put those words into that character's mouth. He probably couldn't do that today without more clearly distancing it from the mind of the author. Fortunately, it doesn't happen often, but you will see it here and there. Another writing quirk that pops out, and what is really my only criticism of the book, is that Tevis's portrayal of a female is a bit one-dimensional. It's hard to tell if he's simply depicting a linear female with shades of the tomboy in her, or if he's not skilled enough to draw a female and is actually subconsciously writing a stereotypically male character dropped into a female, or maybe thinking about his own boyhood and borrowing from that to shape Beth. I'm not arguing for gender stereotypes. In fact, I appreciated the fluidity in Beth's character. But there are some aspects to being female that can be identified as such, and Tevis hits and misses on the portrayal. Sometimes he comes across as though he forgets he's writing a 13-year-old female and just lapses into writing a 13-year-old male. I get it. Not every author can write all genders. In Lady Chatterley's Lover, D.H. Lawrence captures a lonely but dedicated 27-year-old married woman living as though she's a widow to chef's kiss perfection. He just nails it. Constance Chatterley's doubts, her sense of her youth slipping away, her desires, her resentment as a woman who wants more than she's getting in her marriage bargain, Lawrence gets it just right. Tevis is simply not as skilled at capturing the nuances of a young girl and young woman. The result of Tevis not knowing which layers to add for a well-drawn female is that he doesn't draw the complicated male he subconsciously taps into embodied by a female either, which would be far better because we would have a thoroughly drawn character. He ends up in the middle with an underdrawn, stripped-down character, and it makes Beth frustratingly one-track at times, occasionally doing things that are inane and kind of out of alignment with her otherwise savvy intelligence. A non-spoiler minor plot point example is when she comes of age in an obvious way. In the book, her approach to that event is not realistic at all. Tevis has her treat it like she's lost her cleats and has to play through the pickup football game anyway. As Beth matures, she carries this same kind of disconnect with her. If you've only seen the series, you'll say, well, that's just how she is, because the series kind of leaned into it. But when you read the book, you realize that some of the mystifying Beth behavior comes from Tevis's inability to find his inner Judy Blume. A teeny bit more, "Are you there, God, it's me, Margaret," wouldn't have hurt. And Tevis arguably ignores what might have been a more upsetting event for Beth if he hadn't written it almost like boys will be boys and simply ordered us to not see it as disturbing. On the other hand, going back to Bobby Fischer in the real world for a second, even though it's the 1960s, the book stays away from Vietnam and the civil rights movement. I also don't recall any references to the space race. We get just a touch of JFK and Nixon, and even the Cold War manages to take a back seat despite many of the characters in the book being Russian chess players. But for this particular story, all of that is a good thing, despite the historical and cultural significance of these 1960s events that would obviously, legitimately, occupy valuable real estate in any story set in the 1960s. But here, we live in Beth's vacuum, and that vacuum is okay for this journey. The book still enjoyably captures mid-century modern life, the freedom to walk to the store late at night at a young age and be totally safe doing it, waiting for news to show up in a newspaper, appearing in Life magazine as an allegory for going viral, social life existing almost entirely face-to-face, close to no adult supervision and having access to vices as opposed to devices that track us. So in Queen's Gambit world, it's pretty easy to cop a cigarette from an adult's stash or get into the liquor cabinet after school. Certainly that's all possible now too, and I'm not advocating for any of that, but the total lack of surveillance gives it a more wide open and daring feeling that's realistic for the time. So many of the best parts of this novel, whether happy or sad events, come from that 1960s freedom and Beth's approach to it. Also, Beth has a wonderful cast of characters in her life, and not all of them play chess or even understand it. Because the book focuses on Beth's childhood and young adulthood, you get a nice mix of all of what comes with that in terms of angst and shenanigans. If you're looking for a book that will surprise you in its ability to keep you turning the pages, considering that at half of its center is a game played in utter silence, possibly over a 4-hour period, The Queen's Gambit is probably for you. If you've read The Queen's Gambit, please let everyone know in the comments section, and please share what you thought of the book or tell us what else you're reading. And please like, share, and subscribe. That's all for now. I hope you'll come back to the channel to see what's next, to let us know what you're reading, and to see what dreams may come when you enjoy the read. Thanks for watching!